When Christopher Columbus discovered the wonders of Cuban wildlife, he declared that this was the most beautiful land he'd ever set eyes on. Five centuries later,
aún en esas circunstancias, Cuba y la revolución cubana seguirían luchando y seguirían resistiendo.
60 years of lack of means, isolation and embargo have led the Cuban people to adopt an ecological strategy with little or no pollution from heavy industry, without chemical agriculture, and with a non-existent industrial fishing fleet. The result of this forced segregation is a legacy which is as unexpected as it is exceptional. Cuba has remained a unique natural paradise. Dozens of species which have vanished from neighbouring countries continue to live here, and the Cuban mangroves are amongst the richest in the world. On the flip side of this coin, this lack of means has often prevented Cuban scientists from carrying out in-depth studies of their territory that is the size of Switzerland. Suddenly, once again, history moves into action.
Todos somos americanos.
The isolation of Cuba will soon be a memory, and it is anticipated that in the coming 5 years, the average number of tourists will go from 3 to 7 million in a country of barely 11 million souls. Neither the Cubans nor the ecosystem of this island are ready for this human avalanche. Eduardo Abreu is one of about 30 scientists from the Cuban Department of Ecology who are suddenly caught up in a race against time. They only have 2 or 3 years in which to find essential reproduction zones, inventory the endangered species, and eradicate the invasive intruders. A huge task which will allow Cuba to absorb the avalanche of tourists at the same time as conserve the unique characteristics of this ecological wonderland. Cuba is so teeming with life that the first challenges to be taken up are apparent to everyone. Each year after the first rains of April, a phenomenon takes place in Cuba that is seen nowhere else in the Atlantic. Several million red crabs leave the humidity of the mangroves and the forests to go back to the sea in order to lay their eggs. But to achieve this, they must cross a dangerously busy road. Despite the limited number of cars at the disposal of Cubans, tens of thousands of crabs lose their lives during this ordeal, leaving only the slippery carpet of their crushed bodies to bear witness.
It's the same thing every year. The road is covered with crabs, and they're not even edible. Sometimes you'll see 6 or 7 cars pulled up over on the side because crabs have punctured their tires.
Between the crystalline lagoons and the wild mangroves, over a distance of 40 kilometers, this migration crosses the only road linking the principal tourist centers of the island's south coast, a problem which Eduardo urgently needs to resolve.
The southern region of Cuba, the Zapata swamps, are a growing tourist attraction, meaning that national and international tourism increases the region's population enormously. For example, in the spring, at the end of each week, we find ourselves with 25,000 to 30,000 people who, naturally, use transport to get here. So we are faced with the massive destruction of crabs, which are crushed under the wheels of cars. It's an element that needs to be studied quickly in order to avoid, or at least minimize, the terrible effects of this massacre on the red crab population.
This large-scale massacre, in addition to its direct effect on the animal population, upsets the process of natural selection. It is no longer the strongest which survive, but those who are lucky enough to dodge the traffic. These exclusively land-dwelling crabs have a particularity which obliges them to face this ever-growing danger. Each female has to leave her 85,000 eggs in the calm waters of the Caribbean Sea, where the young crabs spend the first stage of their development. Paradoxically, if a female falls into the water while laying, she drowns. Two months later, the young crabs, which have been spared by the numerous predators, leave the aquatic life behind them and cross back over the road to return to their forest dwelling. If the 20,000 cars which daily await them give them the chance. Thus, the young crabs return to the 6,000 square kilometres of mangroves of the Zapata swamp. For the moment, this young Hutia, one of the last Cuban representatives of a vast family of Caribbean rodents, the largest of which was the size of a bear, only has one enemy to look out for: the Cuban crocodile. Well aware of the agility of this predator, these rodents are rarely caught napping. But a new enemy, freshly arrived from Florida, could upset the tranquility of their existence. Eduardo and Gustavo Souza, in charge of the Boca de Guama crocodile farm, are checking to see if the newcomer is encroaching upon the Cuban crocodile's space.
There are two very different crocodile populations in Cuba: the acutus, commonly known as the American crocodile, and the rhombifer, which is the true Cuban crocodile. The American crocs live just about everywhere, but the only Cuban crocodiles living in the wild are found within quite a small area in the Bay of Pigs, the Ciénaga de Zapata. This means that if you analyze the crocodile populations of the world, the Cuban crocodile stands out as the species which is the most rare, and consequently, it is in great danger. Added to this, American and Cuban crocodiles can interbreed and reproduce. The Americans enter Cuban territory, forcing us to tackle the problem of hybridization, which is a real danger for the Cuban crocodile population.
There are only 4,000 Cuban crocodiles still living in the wild. This population would sink without trace if it became crossed with the American population, which is much more powerful and can measure up to 6 meters long compared to 2 meters for the Cuban species. Inquisitive by nature and not afraid of man, the rhombifer willingly comes into the open to watch any unusual goings-on.
Let's go forward. Ah, look at that. Try to stop it from diving.
Have you got it?
Hold on to it.
Go around.
They now need to check if it's a rhombifer.
It's a rhombifer.
Gustavito has a secret trick. When he exerts pressure on the crocodile's eyelid, it instinctively calms down.
There. You see the scales sticking out and the color of the eyes?
Yes.
It's definitely a rhombifer. And at the end of the snout, there are no perforations.
For a long time, it was believed there was only one species, but recent genetic testing highlighted the singularity of the Cuban crocodile.
Look at the pattern of the scales. You have 2, 2, 4, and 2. It's definitely a rhombifer. We'll take a scale sample for genetics.
Do you have the sample bottle?
The only way to be sure that the animal isn't a hybrid is to carry out a genetic concordance test.
Mind your hand.
I'm going to release it.
Let go if you like. I'm holding it tightly.
The sample is a way of cataloging it, so we'll give it an identification number.
What number are you up to for rhombifers?
This one will be number 231. This way we'll have more information if we catch it again.
In order to safeguard the rarest crocodile species in the world, tourism will be capped within its vital habitat. The crocodile is an emblematic Cuban animal. The very island itself is crocodile-shaped. This species is certainly one of the major representatives of the Cienagas endemic wildlife. Eduardo meets up with Lazaro Vinola, who is writing a thesis on the history of the Cuban crocodile. Lazaro is paying a visit to one of the excavation sites he's working on. Eduardo considers it important to find out precisely when the Cuban crocodile's feeding habits changed.
Oh, it's quite clearly the tooth of a crocodile, and a large one.
Yes.
And what species do you think this tooth belongs to?
Based on just one tooth, it's very difficult to tell the species. But we found bones as well, parts of the skull from which it's possible to determine that it's a rhombifer.
Quite an imposing animal.
Yes.
It needed a lot of meat, an animal weighing...
More than 200 kilograms.
Wow.
Cuban crocodiles of the time could grow to be much bigger than they are today.
How come?
Partly because their prey was bigger.
Over the time you've worked here, have you managed to establish which period these archaeological finds, these bones, date from?
The first relics were found in this cave at the end of the 90s by a researcher working in collaboration with the American Museum. By using the carbon-14 technique, he managed to determine that these remains are all about 5,300 years old.
Right, so they're extremely old. That places them in the Holocene era.
Yes, and during that era, there was no human presence in Cuba. The present-day crocodile population is only a fraction of what it was in the past.
The problem of invasive species like crocodiles is extremely worrying and urgently needs to be resolved. But while some of these invasions came about naturally, one was the result of serious human error. For the last 2 decades, the fish in Cuban rivers have widely fallen foul to an insatiable predator, a pest which is ousting from some of Cuba's endemic species and pushing them towards extinction. This menace has a name: the Chinese catfish. But what is this fish from the other side of the world doing in Cuban rivers? This is a major subject of conversation between different generations of Cuban biologists, those of the revolution like Eduardo, and those of the generation of changes like Yaniel, Eduardo's son, who only has a few years to protect Cuban wildlife as best he can.
You know, Dad, when I go diving in the rivers, I've noticed there are still huge numbers of catfish. How long have they been in Cuba? Because the quantity of them in the rivers today is unbelievable.
In the early 2000s, the catfish was introduced as a way of resolving the population's food question. At the beginning, the idea was to fill the locks with this species in order to stop it escaping into the wild. But they hadn't counted on cyclones. And that was when Mitchell struck, a very powerful cyclone. The locks overflowed and all the larvae escaped into the rivers of the Ciénaga de Zapata.
To deal with Chinese catfish, Cubans use nets to block the rivers and funnel all the fish into pockets where they become trapped. This technique allows the fish to be kept alive for several days. Each time Ignacio goes to the traps, he releases the Cuban species and just keeps the catfish. This way, the local fish can regain the upper hand.
I remember that in the past, the number of catfish was incredible. When I dived in places like this, they would come bumping into my mask. Is it still the same today?
No, things have changed. For example, to give you some figures, at the time, they were catching more or less 18 tons of them a year. I'm talking about the beginning of the 2000s. But now we catch about 2 tons.
Would you say fishermen are strongly encouraged to catch catfish? Is turnover and pay reasonable?
These days, the government pays us very well for catching catfish. It's fixed at around 2,500 pesos the ton, and it's paid in convertible currency. Yes, there's a real incentive.
Nobody foresaw the extent of the catfish invasion and its destructive effect. To deal with it, an even more ferocious predator needed to be found: man. Because time is precious, Eduardo and Yaniel have already taken up a fresh challenge. Cuban biodiversity seems to be cracking in many places. Is there not one problem-free place on this island? There exists in Cuba a secret, mysterious world, a domain which few Cubans know of, and which only the island's animals frequent. Spread over 1/5 of the island's subsurface, a labyrinth of caves, funnels, rivers and underground lakes captures water coming from the mountains and plains and carries it without further contact with the exterior towards the coastal mangroves. A world which only reveals itself once every 1,000 years, when the roof of a cave collapses, opening a window into this unknown domain and its enigmatic inhabitants. Studying these rocky faults, known as cenotes, is far from being a simple business for Cuban biologists. Although some are easily accessible, most of them are hidden within hundreds of square kilometers of frequently impenetrable mangrove. Eduardo, Yaniel and teams from the park need to check one by one if the cenotes are free of invasion by American crocodiles, catfish, or the slightest pollution. Because within this closed system, one invaded zone would contaminate the entire underground world.
Right. Get into the water carefully and keep your wits about you while you're exploring the cenote. Be careful. Crocodiles can be dangerous and appear out of nowhere to attack you.
This sunken forest slowly became petrified. In the first 10 meters, the clear fresh water arriving from the mountains favors the proliferation of algae, which give everything a ghostly appearance. As for the bottom of the cenote, it is filled with salt seawater, fluctuating to the rhythm of the tides. Where the two layers of different water meet, they play together and twist and intertwine without ever uniting. Overcome with curiosity, a crocodile leaves its hiding place to study this strange visitor more closely. Another inhabitant, one of the strangest, also comes to take a look. A manjuari or Cuban gar. It's a very rare animal, a genuine living fossil which has existed in its present form for 100 million years. It's probably the evolutionary link between fish and mammals.
Did you see any crocodiles?
Just now as I was coming up, there's a little cave, and that's where I saw one. Huge, a good 2 meters. I saw it twice, unless there were two of them. Then on the way back, I saw a fish about so big, very slender, with a muzzle a bit like a crocodile's, and lots of teeth.
That's a manjuari, and indeed, its name derives from its teeth. In the original Cuban language, aruaga, manjo means many, and ari means teeth. And the major part of this fish population has links with the cenotes, where the living conditions are favorable, and they have an easy access to the mangrove swamps.
So it seems that the Cuban gar, which was thought to be dying out because of the catfish invasion, has found a safe haven in the closed system of caves and cenotes of Cuba. Continuing his research, Yaniel meets André Hurtado, who, to counter the predicted disappearance of these prehistoric Cuban fish, has set up a highly efficient emergency plan.
We'll put river water in this container.
To avoid any thermic or chemical shock, the fish are firstly acclimatized in a cool box. André has dedicated the last 10 years of his scientific life to raising these rare fish. For the first time in decades, baby Cuban gar returned to the rivers which catfish stole from their parents.
In order to save endangered species, we've set up a reproduction center for different fish which are endemic to Cuba, like the manjuari, in order to produce larvae. Seeds for the future, as you might say. We raise them, and when the conditions are favorable, we release them back into the wild to bring the population back up to its original level. That's the idea, and that's why we're here today with park employees to attempt some reintroduction. We believe that this is the right place and time.
Andre, why was this particular place chosen for releasing baby manjuari?
Take a look. The water is calm, there are plenty of places to take refuge, and there are a lot of little fish to prey upon. In our research, we've observed that habitats similar to this are where they are the most numerous and healthy.
For the biologists from the parks, careful management of these largely uninhabited mangroves and rivers could provide the island with a way of balancing tourism, economic development, and preservation of its natural heritage. Although safeguarding the natural environment is a priority for Eduardo and the natural park employees, another sizable problem needs to be resolved. It is in direct opposition to the dream of an ecological paradise and needs to be controlled quickly. This is a country where the average monthly salary is €20, 50 for a surgeon. At certain difficult moments of the revolution, like the so-called special period following the withdrawal of Russian aid to Cuba in 1990, poaching was for some the only means of survival. The growing demand of tourists for exotic souvenirs arouses the greed of those looking for easy money. And tourists arrive in ever-increasing numbers. With a market of €100,000 million per year, animal trafficking represents the third largest source of illegal income in the world after drugs and armaments, and a major battle for the biologists of the natural parks. We are in the west of Cuba, in the Pinar del Rio region, the territory of a symbolic animal of the island. The Cuban parakeet is very rare and appears on the Washington Convention International Trade in Endangered Species list. Eduardo has come to meet Armando, who runs a program dedicated to saving and reintroducing these unique birds.
Hi, how are you? Is the reproduction going well? What's your goal with this breeding program?
We're part of a large network involved in protecting species. But our principal concern here is the Cuban parakeet.
Why? What is the problem with the species today?
The problem is that a lot of people want to keep them at home. They're captured to serve as pets. There are already problems specific to this island. We're in the path of cyclones and tropical storms which destroy the environment, and in particular the palm trees where the birds nest. Now we have to add the even bigger problem of poaching. With so many people wanting parakeets as pets, the market price has gone up.
How much do they cost now?
That depends where you buy them. Here in Agua Grande, where they are captured, they sell for about $20 to $25. But when you go further afield, to Varadero, you're talking about $40 to $50. In Havana, one bird can sell for $80.
$80?
Yes, $80 in Havana.
At that price, it's not surprising that the species draws attention. And is the problem just at a national level?
No, there are poachers
Who manage to get them across the borders?
Yes, they get round the controls and take animals out of the country. We learned recently that in Mexico, for example, Cuban parakeets have been sold for 1,000 euros each.
Wow. At that price, it's very worrying for the future of these birds.
A bird sold in town for 80 euros represents 3 or 4 months' salary. Even on a small scale, this trafficking is an easy source of income. For the moment, the 20 or so couples released each year are enough to keep the Cuban parakeet population stable, but an increase in tourism will inevitably result in an increase in demand. And bird trafficking is not the only such business. Upon returning to his inspection of the Zapata swamp, Eduardo is confronted with a case on a worrying scale. He's acquired access to an extraordinary document seized by Cuban customs officers. Faced with the size of the threat, Eduardo has urgently called in Roberto Tarragona, known as Toby, a pioneer in Cuban ecology.
I'm sure they're near to Mañadero.
Me too. And you, Gustavito?
Take a look at the size of those crocodile heads.
Yes. And this type of ecosystem is typical of the zone.
Listen carefully to what they're saying. They traveled 3 days and hunted for 13 days to capture those animals. That means they're increasing their activities and going deeper into the mangrove each time. How many animals do you think there are on each boat?
To be certain, we'd have to watch the whole video. But there are between 50 and 60 animals.
The boats are so weighed down that the poachers can't even get on board themselves and are having to push them.
Comparing the number of crocodiles by boat with the price of the meat, there's about $3,000 worth there.
That's quite a sum.
$3,000.
Now it's no longer a question of survival.
You're right. It's to make a fortune.
This video proves that there's a demand. This is only going on because there's a market.
But what market, Gustavito?
Eduardo, tourism, of course, tourism.
Of course, increasing tourism.
Tourism is the root cause of this.
Of course. It increases the demand for the meat of crocodiles and other wild species. The only alternative we have is to increase production of crocodile meat in the rearing farms in order to satisfy demand. Nobody foresaw that demand would be so high.
For Gustavito, this video proves 2 things. On the one hand, the program for reintroducing rhombifers to the wild needs to be boosted, without delay. But he also needs to increase the number of American crocodiles being raised. At the moment, the crocodile farm produces 1 ton of meat each year, destined exclusively for the tourist industry. To satisfy the urgent demand from hotels and restaurants and thereby discourage poaching, production needs to be increased to 2 tons, starting this year. Let's hope that within 4 or 5 years, the rhombifer crocodiles will repopulate most of the zones which they occupied originally, and that the increase in population will remove them from the list of endangered species. To achieve this, poaching needs to become clearly illegal. Today it is not condemned under Cuban law. In numerous regions of the island, a major part of conservation work consists of taking an inventory in the field. Next, it is necessary to evaluate the risk of pollution or destruction of the natural habitat which pressure from tourism or uncontrolled industrial development could provoke. Today, Eduardo is taking a general inventory of the forests in the west of the country. Numerous animals which only now exist in Cuba answer the roll call. The Cuban parakeet, of course. but also the dwarf frog, measuring only a centimetre long. And the polymeter, known as the painted snail because of its various colours. The turkey vulture, the blue-headed quail dove, the Cuban trogon, or chocororo, which is the country's mascot. And the Cuban false chameleon, which is the only lizard capable of changing its colour and appearance. As for the green woodpecker, it is one of the forest's biggest builders. To please the female, the male tirelessly builds new nests, transforming the palm tree trunks into blocks of apartments which are quickly snapped up by eager new residents. But this noisy neighbour ruffles the feathers of certain night-working tenants, like the Cuban pygmy owl, which at 10 centimetres tall is the smallest owl in the world.
In this wooded area, the palm trees are the smallest. Sometimes the tops are cut by lightning, leaving just the trunks. During their reproduction cycle, the woodpeckers hollow out numerous cavities at different levels. And as soon as they abandon them, other birds endemic to the island, like the pygmy owls, parakeets, and parrots, take their place. But unfortunately, these palm tree trunks are cut down by poachers during the hatching period so that they can collect babies and eggs to sell them. This results in less palm trees, and therefore less chance for the woodpeckers to build shelters, which means much fewer nests for other species. It's a real problem for us because we're beginning to see competition between the species, which is highly detrimental. At this very moment, we're carrying out studies to determine which bird species live at which level of each palm tree trunk so that we can build artificial nests in other trees at the right height for each type of bird. This way, we can make up for the numerous missing palm trees.
Clearly, being one of the rare small-sized wild mammals on an island isn't conducive to a restful life for the Hutias. Silent and quick, a rainbow boa has already noticed it. But once again, the agile little rodent gets away with just a fright. The Cuban boa is listed as an endangered species because its reputation as a hen thief turned villagers against it, and it has been relentlessly hunted. Eduardo believes that once this forest has been accorded the status of a wildlife sanctuary, the boa could have a long-term future here. He just needs to catch a few dozen of them to estimate the density, gender, and age of the population. Easier said than done.
Unos 70.
1 meter 70.
Faced with the richness of the wildlife which he encounters during each visit, Eduardo is in no doubt. The forest of Vinales needs to be recognised as a priority conservation area. The biologists only have 1 or 2 years in front of them because the town is developing rapidly. Fortunately, the locals are already taking an interest in their natural heritage.
Hi, Barnaby. Perhaps we'll be lucky enough to see a few zunzunzitos.
There's always something to see. Just coming to the house attracts them.
Oh, yes.
They're always here for me.
It's as simple as that.
Of course, we live here together.
Having scoured the woods for them in vain, I come here and can watch them with you.
Look at them. They're waiting for us.
It's true, they seem to be here for us.
Almost invisible in the forest, the bee hummingbird is the smallest bird in the world, hardly 6 centimeters long and weighing only 2 or 3 grams. Cubans call it zunzun because of the sound of its wings, which beat 80 times per second. It is one of the most vulnerable creatures in the Cuban forest.
In 30 years of study, I have never seen zunzun and zunzuncitos in one and the same place. You've really created a very special space for them here.
Yes, I think you're right. Firstly, it's a question of giving them a lot of love and care. Then they need to be given food and protection from animals which can harm them. I also protect them from humans who come with cages and arrows. I've made that impossible around here.
You know, what's going on here is unique, and it's a wonderful achievement. It just goes to show how even an individual action can make a difference. What's more, thanks to this example, people from the region are more careful about nature around them. Tourism is increasing, and this will bring economic benefits to the local population. This is how we create the means to defend this area which we love and which is important to us.
Yes, you're right.
The good state of health of the Cuban lagoons and mangroves is vital for the future of all the wetlands of Central America. Why? Cuba is the principal and virtually the last migration corridor for birds between North America and South America. Without Cuba, there would be no possible stop-off for these long-haul travelers. An ecological catastrophe. Eduardo meets the ornithologist Lourdes Muica for an inventory-taking expedition in the Zapata swamp in the south of the country.
Look, it's nice and open here for counting.
It's a classic feeding ground, wouldn't you say?
Look, there's a heron. And those are white ibis. There are some young feeding with the adults.
Oh, yes.
The young are not the same color. There are some egrets, too.
Roseate spoonbills.
Spoonbills, yes.
The Caribbean and Atlantic migration corridors you mentioned, how many bird species do they account for out of all the Cuban birds?
Here, there are about 178 bird species migrating from the north and 14 coming from the south, which means to say that 77% of Cuban birds, out of the 379 existing species, are migratory. And believe it or not, you only see them twice a year. Now, September and October when they head south, and February and March when they go back to North America. All the Central American zones are interconnected, which means that all that we undertake here, in terms of species conservation, has consequences thousands of kilometers away in other wetlands, such as Yucatan, northern Colombia, as well as the Bahamas. This interconnection places an obligation on our government to ensure that the level of conservation achieved on the island is maintained.
Yes, but we need to take into account that the development of tourism could be a disturbing factor.
Absolutely. We're going to need to be careful about the number of tourists who can enter each zone. Those of you who live here need to pass the message on. If tourists come here, it's not just because the name Ciénaga de Zapata is known. It's because it's a name associated with a totally preserved site where there are vast numbers of wild birds and species. This is a unique migration corridor. And this will only remain the case if birds can get rest here. The population needs to understand that this natural heritage is the greatest wealth they possess, and that it attracts people and money here. So the inhabitants need to be involved in this conservation. They need to be part of the solution, not the problem.
The 5,000 kilometers of Cuban coastline are home to half of the mangroves of Central America. Animals such as Florida's white pelicans, which were not seen in Cuba 10 years ago, now come and settle here, because in Florida, as in all the other Caribbean countries, the increasing construction of hotels and marinas is resulting in the disappearance of wildlife. Will Cuba write the final chapter of this catastrophe by destroying the vital migration corridors? Of course, the answer is no. Cubans are much too independent, too proud of their particularity and their natural heritage for that. For 10 years or so, many Cubans have been traveling abroad for work or to visit relatives. This cultivated people is well aware of the detrimental effects which could come about through the sudden lifting of the embargo and an influx of easy money. 5 centuries after Christopher Columbus, the arrival of the first giant ship goes almost unnoticed. By a strange twist of fate, the arrival of the cruise ships coincides with a staggering discovery. The only venomous mammal species in the world, thought to have completely disappeared, the agouti, has suddenly made a reappearance in the island's undergrowth. Will it become the mascot of tomorrow's Cuba, the symbol of the great Central American wonderland? Only time will tell.